but I didn't believe she was dead, so I uncovered her toe and touched it. I cried, "Her toe is still warm. She not dead. Her toe are warm." What happened to Bob Marley's grandmother? So in the last episode, we went over Cedella Booker. She was born Cedella Markham, and we went over her early life, and now she is about 10 years old. So let's get started. One morning in 1935, we awoke to hear that the nearby district of Cave Valley had been flooded by heavy rain. And my father decided to drive his motor car over there and have a look. Her father has a motor car in 1935. So, as we read last week, her father has substance, okay? At the time, he owned one of the only motor cars in the district. But before we went, my mother, who was heavy with her 10th child, remember we talked about her father's 20 to 30 children, her mother had 9 and she was pregnant with the 10th, called me into her room and groaned, "Go up to Miss Mud and tell her to come to me. I don't feel well." I walked up the hill to Miss Maud's house and brought her back with me. Inside the room, my mother was complaining that her head hurt and that she felt sick, as if someone had marked a 10 cross over her forehead, which is a magical cross that can draw evil. Mark that part there. Mark that. So the mother says she felt like, and she gave a spiritual parallel to what it felt like was happening to her. Also remember that at this time, he has Métis. Omariah has different women all around, and they're not necessarily, we are fam. They're not necessarily coming together in unity. Okay. Miss Maud noticed that my mother had on a red handkerchief tied around her head and said, "Miss Bertha, take off the red tied. Maybe it draw the pain." I thought she had it for Run the Duppy, but they say run Duppy, but okay. My mother did, but taking off the head tie didn't help. My father and I left in his motor car with some other men and drove to Cave Valley, where we saw only the gullies were flooded and water had not reached the road. On the way back, a man named George Henry flagged us down at the bottom of the hill and said, "Costas, your wife is dying." Or, "Costas, your wife is undying." My father raced up to the house and then quickly left in his motor car to summon Dr. Lloyd from the distant town of Claremont. The next morning when I awoke, I heard a soft singing coming from the drawing room. I tiptoed into the room to find several of my mother's sisters gathered in a solemn circle, singing the mournful song, "Blessed Hour of Prayer." My heart beating fast, I rushed into my mother's bedroom and found her laying still, covered under the lumpiness of a bedsheet. So she had something going on with her in hard labor, and unfortunately, I actually should have said trigger warning at the beginning of this. I might just put in a trigger warning for those who may be triggered by this content. Okay. She had died during the night as I slept, she says, but I didn't believe she was dead, so I uncovered her toe and touched it. I cried, "Her toe is still warm. She not dead. Her toe are warm." But the adults poured into the bedroom and shooed me away from my mother's deathbed, she says. The doctor came later and took out a dead baby from her body. He said the baby had been dead inside for 3 days. So a dead baby inside, probably she went and had a fever. Her body started reacting adversely to the baby who had died, and she didn't pass it in enough time, and she took sick. My father supervised the building of a cedar coffin and placed her dead mother inside. By the tradition of the time, he did not work directly on the coffin himself, for that would look to the world as though he was taking an active hand in sending his wife away. She says that she remembers that the children took the shavings of the carpenters had left from making the coffin and started a fire with them, saying that they were cooking supper. Some of the adults tried to stop us from burning the shavings of her mother's coffin, but her father, who was very downhearted, said, "Let them steer." And we were left with our game of cooking with firewood from her. That's an interesting. That is an interesting memory right there. from her mother's coffin while the grown-ups went about the grim business of the burial. Her mother was laid to rest that evening in a burial plot on the property. Not yet 10 years old, she was left motherless on the earth. So that is what happened to Cedella Marley's mother, and basically she dies way before Bob Marley is born. So let's continue. She says her mother was dead. Pupa, as we used to call my father, was busy with his fields. Years later, he would marry a woman named Lurlyn Brown from Lucky Hill in the parish of St. Mary. She would move into my mother's room and sleep in my mother's bed. That must have been difficult. And again, he has many children. Remember, the mother has nine, and Cedella is the sixth of these nine children, right? And so that must have been difficult. The question is, who's taking care of the children? I was now only 10 years old and still attending school. And don't worry, Norval Marley will be making an appearance very soon. So don't worry, this is a little lull, but it is important to the story. So make we go and read. School was miles away down the country road, even though I was a playful child who used to skip and run the whole way. You were so up 10 miles to school. It still took an hour or two to reach. In those days, there was no bus, and the only transportation throughout the country parts of the island was what Jamaicans jokingly called foot mobile, meaning you walk. If you were late for school, the teachers wouldn't admit us to class, and we would be left sitting on the banks of the roadside all day long in the burning sun. What does that teacher they mean? Or worse yet, we would be beaten for tardy. Wait, how come you never reach pan time? I just didn't like school. I didn't like being cooped up for hours under the rule of a sour-faced teacher like Man Jackson. I longed to escape the stuffy classroom and run around in the daylight breeze. Sometimes I would set out for school but never get there because I stopped to romp in the fields all day with other children. Mommy, I play hooky. That one. If my mother had been alive, she would have made me continue school, she says. But Mama was gone, and our Papa, was a sympathetic man. If I cried that I didn't want to go to school one day, he would say, "Don't force a child to go if she don't want to." And that would be that. Well, you say, you know what, eat your vegetable, don't worry about it. Well, you say, you know what, God's school is all right. Leniency. She says one afternoon, shortly after the death of her mother, she was walking home from school when she saw her sister Amy on the hillside, trailing behind on by a gang of upper form bullies. Surrounded by her tormentors, she was crying and not fighting back. Remember, she did thump her brother in the mouth just the last chapter. Racing to her side, I picked up a stone, Ratty, David, and Goliath, and flung it point blank in the face of the jeering ringleader, busting head, whooping with a splatter of blood. Miss Booker. The other boys tried to gang upon me, but arming myself with the rocks from the field, I stood my ground and dared them to come now, run up in a this. Let me lick you with this. Eventually, after much bellowing of threats back and forth over the wails of the wounded ringleader, look where she do, Johnny, whose head was still gushing blood, my sister and I beat a retreat, leaving one boy bloody, his companion shrieking with curses. A few days later, when I got word that the same boys were plotting to ambush me, hey, you see that girl? I said, let me catch her on the road, man. I tell you, let's see what you do with that. That morning on the road to school, I went to Papa and said, Papa, me I go follow your God ground, sir. She's like, guess what? I'm not going to school today. Meaning that I wanted to go with him that day into the fields, which was how I loved to spend my days. He looked me over and said simply, come on, no, tie your head and come. I was about 10 years old. From that moment on, my hated schooling was over forever, and my daylight hours would be spent mainly in the fields besides Papa. Again, with the parallels, do you remember, or I don't know if I went over there, but a little tidbit in the book that she talks about Bob Marley is like one day around he's 14 years old or something, he comes home with some books and tell his mother, Mommy, me done, me now go back to school. So you see the parallel again that the son did what the mother did. For one reason or another, they didn't want to be in school. Let's continue. Because why? Mr. Norval is about to make his entry. Every day after I followed Papa to Smith, which was about 3 miles up the mountain slope, and help cultivate his land, Papa always had men laboring in the fields of Smith, scattered around the hillside, digging yam hole, clearing land for planting, or cutting bush for manure. I spent my days carrying yam heads and dropping them on the yam banks for the laborers to plant. Sometimes I would spend the morning cutting and planting potato slips. On other days, I would plant peas or follow the men as they dug holes for me to plant corn. I would drop 4 grains of corn into each hole and cover it up with my bare foot, working my way up a hillside furrow. I also began helping Papa do the cooking, for the laborers had to be fed daily. We had a big 3 foot pot in the kitchen at Smith, and every day we cook up a meal the men would eat in the shade of a towering breadfruit tree where Papa used to tie up his horses and donkeys. So she said she quit school and she had got farm. Okay. When the pot of the food was ready, Papa would step outside of the kitchen on the hillside, groan and bellow, "Osa! Osa!" And the laborers at this call would lay down them tools. Boy, I did well on me, no gas in the bush, me shut. Sorry. Would lay down their tools, belly full but they starving. Their machetes and troop down the hillside to sit and eat lunch under the cool of the breadfruit tree. It was in my daily trek to Smith that I began to take notice of a white man on a horse. I think I'm going to put him right here. So. Right here so is the white man on the horse, aka, as promised, Mr. Norval Marley. So this young girl, she said 10 to whatever age, she's going to this field and she now is seeing. This is where she says she saw him, which would be Bob Marley's mother and father. Later on in the story, stay tuned for that. Sees him on the horse. In our district, a white man was a rare thing that drew the eye. I want a white man there. Go. This one was an older man than someone around 50. And I used to see him daily riding his horse up and down the common hills and dirt roads. People said he lived in the settlement of Brissett, that he was an army officer in charge of parceling out the government lands of a place called John Williams to old soldiers. Because a lot of people are saying a lot of things. He was a sailor, he was a this, he was a that. She's telling what the popular conversation was, but remember, she would have been a child at this time, okay? Everyone in the district addressed this white man as Captain. We found out that he was a white Jamaican from the parish of Clarendon. And I also found, yeah, and that was confirmed. But let's continue. And that his name was Norval St. Clair Marley. Our community was so small that everyone knew everyone, either personally or through stories, susus from mouth to ear road throughout the district. A funny story I heard about Captain came to Blanche, one of Pupa's humans. Remember, Blanche are one of the 3 sisters them where they breed 11 times and have 9 picnics. Blanche are one of them. She said that Captain had given a woman on the hillside a plantain to cook for him. Just one plant, Captain. That was one plant you did what? That she had sliced it into 4 pieces, cooked them, and given back 3. Shortly afterwards, according to Blanche, Captain galloped his horse down to the woman's dwelling and demanded, "Hey, girl, which are the 4th piece of plantain there? I one whole plant and you cut it in a floor and with 3 pieces, give me." Let's hope this story ain't true. We all laughed when we heard the story about Captain's stingy nature. Later on, I found out that Captain was really a kind and generous soul, and that the story which was whispered around to make fun of him was probably false. In the Jamaican countryside, even to this day, people often pass the long and idle evenings telling exaggerated stories about one another. You hear what they say about Master John. And since Jamaicans believe that if he don't go, oh sorry, and since Jamaicans believe that if it don't go so, it go near so. That was that the disclaimer, allegedly. That's a Jamaican disclaimer. If it don't go so, it go near so. Meaning, if a story isn't exactly as it is told, it is nearly the way. Once a story starts to make its rounds from veranda to veranda, even if it is untrue, it is likely to be believed. In Jamaica, no name or reputation escapes this idle tale telling. And you have to go stay tuned for this tale as it continue. May I forget to take commercial break. Can me that try get to Mr. Norval. So run the commercial break. Support local authors. Support Caribbean authors. Support our narrative. If you're enjoying this, check out a book that I have right now on Amazon called Island Twist. All right. So stay tuned. Put on your little notification bell too. If you not see when me I go live, click the bell and you will see. All right. So stay tuned because we're going to go in at the Norval Marley saga. Next one.
Real quick, this is Amuna, author and storyteller, and I have a new release available on Amazon because I love writing and reading stories. This is a Caribbean American tale about love and culture. We have a young girl named Jackie, and she gets into it with a lot of frenemies and some other people that's trying to take away our rights. So go ahead and check out Island Twist, available on Amazon today.